You're tuned in to the Brand Ambassador Select Podcast.
Hi, and welcome back to the Brand Ambassador Select Podcast, where we are building connections, showcasing the impressive and inspiring movers and makers. It's Lenore, your host, and as a huge music fan, specifically country music, I am so excited for today's guest. So, over the last 20 years, Jake Brown, an award-winning music biographer, has met and interviewed some of the biggest names in the music industry. I'm going to name literally everybody you probably know, so just wait for it. His extensive resume includes a book on Tupac. He's got one on Dr. Dre, Heart and Motorhead, AC/DC. He's co-written books with Lemmy Kilmister. He has a book, Beyond the Beats, Rock and Roll's Greatest Drummers, where it features drummers of Metallica, Aerosmith, Bon Jovi, Motley Crue. The list goes on and on. His latest biography, Behind the Boards, Nashville, that was just released in June, marks his 50th biography milestone. It features 30 of the biggest producers in Nashville discussing their own personal backstories and the studios and the stories behind all the creations of recording 300 number one hits by some of the country's biggest stars. Like Luke Bryan, we got Carrie Underwood, Brad Paisley, the Dixie Chicks, Thomas Rhett, Sam Hunt, Florida Georgia Line, Martina McBride, Reba. I'm going to stop. I can't name anybody else. We need to bring Jake Brown on. Jake, welcome to the Brand Ambassador Select Podcast.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
So congratulations. You literally hit a huge milestone, your 50th book. Yay!
In 20 years, yeah, I moved here in 2003 with 2 books published, and this summer hit 50. So Nashville's been very good to me.
So the latest book that you have, which is the 50th, is Behind the Boards, Nashville. Can you give us a little bit of details behind that? Because, listen, I name dropped so many people before we got you on the line, so I know that you can even do more.
Yeah, I specialize in books that either are a memoir or focus on the behind the scenes of the record business, be it the writing and recording and the songwriting, business side of it. The producers are maybe the most underappreciated, if not the songwriter within country. If you look at a music video in country, say pop doesn't do it, rock doesn't do it, hip hop, you'll see, if you remember MTV when they still showed videos, it would say artist, song, label, maybe director, and then it would say songwriter. And that piqued my interest about 10 years ago to start the National Songwriter Series. That has third book's coming out now. There's 90 songwriters doing the 3, but nobody really realizes there's these 2 column streets called Music Row in Nashville, where in houses and some buildings, in music publishing houses, these songwriters sit all day and write the songs that many of country music's biggest stars make famous.
Yep.
In the course of that series, I was interviewing people that were more of the traditional model, as well as some that are what you would call track guys, which is to say they are multi-instrumentalists. Amazingly, used to be that you would bring a session band in. Now they still work fast. They knock out 3-4 hits in an afternoon, whereas like a rock band's getting drum sounds in that afternoon. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's really quick.
Yeah, well, even quicker, guys, and I'll just rattle off a few. Joey Moy, who does Florida Georgia Line, Krista Stefano does Carrie Underwood, Zach Crowley does Sam Hunt, Jody Stevens that helps produce Luke Bryan, and etc. It goes on and on. Russ Copperman, who does Dierks Bentley. These guys not only can write songs, but they also produce them in their laptops, quite literally in their Pro Tools rigs. They can play the guitars, they can play the bass, the keyboards, the drums. So by the time they come out of that demo session, they have what a lot of times you hear on the radio, but for a bit of mixing polish. And I thought, wow, that would be interesting to then focus on the country producer side. And from there, because Shane McNally, so from there I had those guys, I started reaching out to others. And before we knew it, we had 30. And everyone is in this book. It's the definitive country music anthology. And it takes fans back to their own personal stories, how they discovered a lot of the happy accidents of Nashville. People come here to be a star. They don't quite make it as a star, but they become a songwriter. That makes them a number one and gives them their career, or they become a producer. There was also a pedigree of people in this book, like Paul Worley, like the great Dan Huff, my God, played on Top Gun soundtrack and all, Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson. He started out a guitar player. These guys learn from behind the other side of the board, you would say, out in the live room. And then they kind of, from the best of the best over the years, Jimmy Bowens and Barry Beckett's and all of these great guys in the 80s, Jim Ed Norman, who's in this book, Norbert Putnam, who did Margaritaville. He was Elvis Presley's bass player before he became a producer. So it gives you an example of how these guys really learned the business from the player side. And then it gives them, when they became producers in their own right, there's so much of a more fluid communication and translation, because they as musicians can speak to the musicians or the artist. There's a really great a common thread within this book. I'm going to think of names and correlate them to the producer. Guys like Kenny Chesney and Buddy Cannon, been working together 25 years. Byron Gallimore and Tim McGraw, 25 years. Luke Bryan and Jeff Stevens, 20 years. Michael Knox and Jason Aldean, 15 years. And there's others. Tony Brown and George Strait was 40 plus hits in 20 years. So these guys connect with an artist oftentimes before they were ever discovered, or they discovered them. And then they stay with them throughout this whole run of, greatest hits. And that's rare. It only really happens in country. You see it a little bit sometimes. Michael Jackson did 2 or 3 records of Quincy Jones, and then he moved on to Teddy Riley, whom, by the way, I'm finishing his book up. That'll be out in a couple years.
Who are you not talking to?
I know, and I never stop working, because if you do, you're dead, so to speak, in this business. But the longevity aspect was also fascinating to me, because that pedigree is unique. So against that kind of collage, if you will, book takes you from, not only, let's say if you're a sort of nerd, like technical nerd, you want to learn about how did this mic get put with this thing? There's guys in this book like the great Dave Cobb, who does Chris Stapleton and Shooter Jennings and Sturgill Simpson and Jason Isbell, and sort of this alt country is Rick Rubin. He employs a lot of really old school record techniques, where he'll take like one mic and record a whole band versus, And so I wanted to show the entire spectrum of country music's producers, because it's not just one. There's so many subgenres in it. There's Americana, there's bluegrass's influence. There's also programmers who have brought in, and I mentioned some of them, Jody Stevens is a great example with Luke Bryan, Play It Again. They bring in all of these different stylistic elements that have infused into country over the last few years and made it such a broader genre now, because I wrote a book a couple years ago with a guy named Big Smo, as country rap artist, as an example. And country rap is something like, huh? But it's another.
Little Nas X just started to kind of do that now. So with Billy Ray on it, we got it.
Yeah. So that shows you the diversity within the genre. And this book, it's 600 pages, hopefully takes you. And if you're a country fan, not only can you learn about, you can stream along and listen to all of your favorite artists and literally hear those hits as you're reading about how they were made. So we're very fortunate with the advent of digital that we were able to integrate all of that.
I have to say, personally, after just listening to you, I am now so sad that all my country concerts have been canceled for the summer.
Yeah, I know, right?
When you were talking about the different styles, I was like, oh my gosh, I was going to see Sam Hunt, and now I'm not, and life is just
You can read
sad.
about how his hits were all made, because Luke Laird, I should mention Luke Laird, who also co-produced Casey Musgraves, who's a big, really blowing up right now. Shane McNally, Josh Osborne. I mean, it's remarkable. I was so very fortunate. Frank Liddell and Miranda Lambert, that's another 15-year example of relationship. So we're so blessed that so many different producers, and that was the other thing. I find with these series that, and I've done, I have in the studio, which I write with, I've done them with Heart, with Motorhead, with Tupac Shakur Estate, Rick Rubin, all across the map. These are an example to take fans inside the making of these albums and interview the band members and the producers and the principals. Ann and Nancy Wilson from Heart, I did one with, example like that, where the fan gets to go inside the studio and sit there behind the console, similar to this book, and feel like they're right there in the recreation of how these albums were made. So if you're a country fan and you can't see live shows, but you are still wanting to sort of get more of an up-close personal sort of rapport with that artist, this book hopefully will help you do that.
Now, who was the first musical artist that you've interviewed? Because I can't even.
For this book or historically?
Historically, because you have so many, and I need to know, did you even fangirl over any of them? Because I'm on this end.
That's not how you last. Yeah, as a piece of advice, if you want to have a career in the record business, don't be a fanboy or a fangirl. It's such a turnoff to the artists. They want to be treated like a normal person. And I think one of the I've worked in the record business 20 years, and I'm also a musician of 7 instruments. So I started out playing in bands myself. And I'm not comparing it to these guys' level, but I can kind of speak that language a little bit. And so when I moved here, I'd already been distributed for several years as a label. And I started out writing in rock. But the very first book I ever did, I actually wrote my first book on a bet. As I had no aspiration to be a writer at all. I just always did it. It was just something that came to me like music kind of did. And I was working at a record label called Cleopatra Records in California. And I was writing all of the copy for their like catalog copy and stuff, and then public press releases. And I met a publicist. And long story short is that publicist kind of dared me to try to write a book. And I said, well, I'm not interested in the client you want me to do it with, but I do want to write a book on Suge Knight, Death Row Records CEO, notorious guy. He was just getting out of prison in 2001. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could find a deal for this book and release it in real time with his release? And we pulled that off. A company named Amber Books, Tony Rose and Yvonne Rose gave me my start. And I wrote for them for about 5 years. I did books, got on everyone, R. Kelly, 50 Cent, Jay-Z, Tupac. In fact, the In the Studio book series, which is trademarked and I've written now for 15 years, was started through that company, through the Tupac Shakur estate. Afeni Shakur authorized it. And I interviewed a lot of his producers. And so my point being, it just kind of took on a natural thing. And I just never had an interest in the sex and the drugs and that crap. I wanted to focus on the music, because there's so much there that you hear 3.5 minutes or 4 minutes. People have no concept of how much work goes into creating that 3.5 and 4 minutes. You know what I mean? And then if you spread that across a stylistically diverse catalog, I've been fortunate enough that I did Joe Satriani's memoir in 2014, Strange Beautiful Music. The Beyond the Beats series I write is with rock drummers. The first book had Motley Crue's drummer, Metallica, Creedence Clearwater, Journey, Bon Jovi, Foo Fighters, Jane's Addiction. I'm just trying to think of them all. Smashing Pumpkins.
You got them all.
On and on. So it just took on kind of its own thing. And I've just been very blessed to be able to get access to these different people, because I just only want to talk with them about music, and they want to talk about music. The Nashville Songwriter Series proceeded that way. And I've just been lucky to have a career that's kind of, from that first Suge Knight book to now, stayed within that lane. Even though, see, you can stay within a niche as a writer, but you've got to brand yourself out. To speak more broadly to your audience, you've got to brand yourself out within a specialty beyond just one lane. You've got to have different series. There's one called Behind the Boards Nashville. You know, and if you do that, then you can, under that banner, write with a lot of different artists, and it gives you a real variety of a palette that can kind of also make you viable, I guess, with different reading audiences. So hip hop's one example, rock's another, country is another. I've done books in the alternative realm with, I did a book on Tom Waits. I've done one on Tori Amos. I did a thing with Billy Corgan a few years ago for Tape Op magazine. We went through his whole catalog and did the Smashing Pumpkins' entire history. Yeah, and interviewed their producers. So hopefully anyone that's trying to make a living as a writer, especially in this climate today, you've got to brand your name, because if you don't brand your name, you have thousands of people banging on that same door that are ready to replace you tomorrow. And so it's just important to find that special, even within fiction, you might have, or romance or nonfiction of a sort of more, say, politics. You got to find a niche, and I recommend trying to stick with it, but then become as diversified within it as you can. So
would you say your secret to your success would be branding?
As much as anything. And I tell people, I get a lot of kids that email me that I've been doing this 20 years that grew up reading my stuff, thankfully, and now some of them want to go do that. And I'm not saying solely because of my books, but my books and other writers. And I tell them all, think of the marketing from the time you sit down to start writing your book. You need to be thinking about the finish line and how you're going to publish it. Because think about this, you could write the greatest book in the world. If you get to the finish line and you don't know what you're going to do with it, a literary agent's going to have no interest in taking you on if they don't have a really strong proposal, as an example. Within that proposal, you have to synopsis the book. You have to compare it to all the competition. You have to do what's called comparative titles. You have to do selling points, marketing points. You have to think about all these things. So the earlier you get started on that, and there's this, sometimes you get these people, oh, that's a sellout. It takes away from the creative process. It inspires the creative process because it opens your mind to all of these different other little nuances you can work into the writing. As an example, I make it a habit of going back through Rock Back Pages and other sites where you can source out, like Country Weekly is not around anymore. It's called Nash Country Daily now. Yeah. I like Country Weekly better, but as a name. But you can go back and we try to quote, excerpts from reviews from 1997, from right in the heart of when that record was coming out. I do all the chart positions. I do how many weeks it was number one, what awards it won. Try to diversify and broadly cover as much as you can within that one song. You might find a page just on that one song. Within writing more broadly, though, I'm relating this to the broader answer to your question. You've got to be thinking about the marketing, and you've got to be thinking about the audience that you want to read your book. If you don't think about that stuff at the outset, some people get to the finish line, but it's a lot harder. because publishers are going to be putting up a lot of money. It's like a $20,000 investment to put out a run of a book. You've got, even if it's only going to be a couple thousand copies out of the gate, that's 10 grand. I pay for publicists. I feel publicists are a very important part of marketing a book. And if an author's willing to put their own money into that, I joke that I'm not trying to disrespect any publicists, but they're like a social worker with 30 cases on their desk. Do you know what I mean? They're only going to be able to give you so much time. So you've got to be able to think entrepreneurially as a writer, and branding is a business. It's just important. And it's not about ego. It's not about having your name out there as much, and to sort of see it out there beyond going, okay, this is someone that writes about this specific thing. He's a reliable reading audience is going to follow him over the years. You got to build that out, though. And the other thing is social media. I can't stand some of the elements of social media like Twitter, but I love Facebook. Yeah. And some people love Instagram. There are so many forums that there's no excuse to not do social media. There's always going to be a way to engage with people. And if you do that, that also creates, my God, you're the one person that might have 500 friends that shares something that you put up. That's 500 more potential readers, right? You multiply that times thousands and thousands and thousands. And then I work very hard to make sure that I everything I do is authorized. There's no anonymous sources. I've never in one of my 50 books had none. I think it's crappy to write with or about someone and not have the exact people talking about them be on the record, but that also ingratiates you to their management and it ingratiates you to them. Then they're gonna, Tommy Lee, who I've worked with a lot of years through different books, he blasted out, that was 1 million people that just through his social media about Beyond the Beat saw that. Billy Corgan did, that was 3 million. So it just shows you, if you can engage the band, they'll put it on their website, they'll tweet it out to their following, and that's more branding. It's all about the product at the end of the day. But as an author, you've got to have a familiarity within a reading audience that knows not only that your books are quality from the writing standpoint, but the interviews that are in them, and also how they're promoted, because the more people that hear about it, the more potential people are going to read it, right?
Jake, I have to say, if you are ever on Jeopardy or Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, if you do not answer all of the music and entertainment questions correct, I'm going to be so disappointed in you.
Well, I hope I'm not giving you too much. I think it's so important.
I love the side of music. I grew up playing the piano, the violin. I'm a huge country music fan to begin with. So even just listening to your stories in general, it's just, you're right. A lot of people don't realize how much work goes behind even a 3.5 minute riff in itself, or just a song, or just a production, and how long it takes to actually get that idea and that song out there, even just to the radio. Lucky enough, it will even play on the radio.
Exactly. Let alone become a number one. Bear in mind, to your point, country music has 2 number 1 charts that weekly sometimes have a different number 1 coming out. That's why the National Songwriter Series was so important, because these people sit there every day with a guitar banging out, sometimes 2 and 3 number 1s in an afternoon. Sometimes it takes a year. The House That Built Me, Tom Douglas, that co-wrote it, told me that took a year. I'm a songwriter. I write sometimes 5 and 6 songs in a day. I might only record 2 of them, but the advice element to these books is super important too. We really pride ourselves in being able to not only have them be entertaining for the country fan, but also educational. And that's the thing. There's a lost art for these newer kids that are learning how to make records, because there's so many samples now. For an example, Florida Georgia Line producer Joey Moy, who started out doing Nickelback with Mutt Lange, right? So he knows how to mic a live drum set. Most people, when they read what's an RE20, it's a common drum mic. You don't know how that sample you're using was first recorded in the studio, because there's fewer studios nowadays. So they don't know what mic placement is. They don't know what an overhead mic is, or what double micing a snare is, or just these things that are so important to creating these sounds. And these books are sort of a reference guide. I'm proud of the fact, as an example, Dave Cobb, in his studio, and he was one of the first 2 or 3 people to sign on to this project. He's like, "Oh man, I've got that Rick Rubin book on my shelf. It's a reference guide." I'm like, "Oh," because I went through, how did Rick Rubin get that guitar sound? Was there 12 Marshall stacks? The Motorhead book, Lemmy was telling me about his 2 amps. He plays these bass through guitar amps. You wouldn't know that if you're hearing Ace of Spades, but it's cool to know how that particular oomph came into the. And the wonderful movie called Fighting with My Family. Born to Raise Hell. You see the fabric of visually these songs match up to. It's really cool, but you want to know, how did they get that? And without being too nerdy about it, you try to make an accessible lane for people to read about it. So that's really another important thing as a writer. You want to try to make your books as accessible as possible, no matter whether you're doing fiction, whether you're doing nonfiction, and not get so wrapped up in your own, what I call internarium, kind of like your own inner narrative. I try to write narrative that's kind of poppy and crisp and quick and kind of, it gets right to the point, and then let the artist talk. Let the producer talk. It's their book. It's not so much my book, even though my name's on the cover. They're the star. And I think that's important too. It's different if you're writing fiction and creating all the characters, but even as a character, you want that character's voice to be the one that speaks. You know what I mean? You want to make sure that your fans connect personally with whatever you're writing about, and then they kind of develop a love for that particular thing. I've done another 30 books that I've ghostwritten, so I've done those all across the map. And that's another piece of advice I'd give out as a writer: never turn anything down. Take anything you can get. I did a book with a porn star named
all
Jasmine.
Opportunities.
Yeah, Jasmine St. Clair. It was the third book I ever did. Through that book, I met Lemmy, which led to the Motorhead book. So I'm just saying, sometimes networking is another hugely important part of branding. You've got to make sure that you network. You got to get out. You got to do, I hate book signings, but I'll do them sometimes. You've got to do release events sometimes. You got to go to book expos if you're early on as a writer, so you can walk around free with that $500 pass that your publisher's paying for, and pitch yourself to other. You're sitting there with the book industry. So a lot of writers are really shy. And a lot of creative people,
Makes sense.
Got to get out there, you know?
Now, you've clearly have said a lot of things that you have learned, but what do you think is the most important message that you've learned and the knowledge that you've learned by writing all of these books?
Wow. I don't know that there's one.
Fine, you can give me a couple. I'll settle for that.
Yeah. I would say, I hate giving advice. I would say the three things that are, because I just don't feel like I'm 44, I guess, so I'm sort of old enough to do it.
You're super knowledgeable. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, and I have so little hair to show it, right? I love your hair. You've got much more than mine, much prettier. But,
I was told to put it in the front today so people can see it.
You know, I think the three things to longevity that are really underappreciated, one of them is work ethic. I work 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. When there is never enough time, but if you devote yourself and you look at time as a tool, I think that that's really important. And it's something that can be, you know, it's a balance, because people are married, they have kids, they have different things. Don't watch television if you can be working instead, or be working while it's on, but always be working is one of mine. Always be hustling is another. By hustling, I mean networking. Always be out there looking for new opportunities. People I interview for these series, sometimes that will branch off into a book with that party, as an example, in my case. But networking is hugely important. Even say, for an example, as a songwriter, don't just write your songs and then play them in a bedroom. You have to go out and play them in public for people, so you can get a reaction from an audience, see whether they work or not, meet other songwriters, co-writing. That would be within that genre. The third one would definitely be the representation that you surround yourself. That classic adage, surround yourself with good people. I just signed with the Folio agency, and Frank Wyman, he did the Irishman and a lot of books. I'm very fortunate after that many years that I'm able to work with an agency like that. But you know, I'm always like your latest book, you're only as good as your latest book. You've got, and relevance is another element to that, but surround yourself with good people. Literary agents are hugely important for writers, but managers are, business advisors, great accountant, a publicist, have an attorney. These are overhead costs. So you've got to also think entrepreneurially, even if it's not really your thing. There's a million ways to read about how to do that. And practically, you know, you learn from mistakes. Some books come out and you spend 2 years on and they bomb. Others come out. I wrote this book in 3 months.
The latest one, the Nashville one?
I wrote it. Now the interviews I had done over the previous year, but I don't do anything until the writing is kind of autopilot. I wrote that book in 3 months. I wouldn't put myself through that rigor again, because it was 20-hour days, but hugely important that you be always thinking about those elements. Because if you sign up with the wrong agent, or you sign up with the wrong manager, or you sign up with the wrong lawyer, or I could go down the list. It can screw you. I mean, it can really mess you up. You can sign a bad contract. Mm-hmm. So those elements are important, and it sounds like flippant or fancy to say, but they all cost money. Either they cost you commissions or they cost you upfront, fees. but they're hugely important at the end of the project. You're going to look back and go, gosh, I'm really glad I spent that $500 to have that lawyer review this contract, because I'm now making 10% more in foreign rights. I've been fortunate. Another thing that I would say, I have a great agent in Japan. I've been published there, I don't know, 6 or 7 books now over the last 20 years. But other countries are really important, because if you can internationally brand yourself out as an author, a bunch of my books came out in England through British publishers, and I deliberately sought out British publishers because they're going to put them out in the States. It's inevitable. Anywhere it's an English-speaking country, they're going to come out. But that gives you another country's reading audience. I've had, fortunately, them out in France, Italy. I just sold one to Italy on a Guns N' Roses guitar player, Izzy Stradlin.
Nice.
And yeah, that book was from '04, and I pulled it because he didn't want it at the time to come out, and got word to me to not do it. Let me mute this. I'm sorry. But anyway, my point is, there are so many elements. It's not just about the writer. You have got to surround yourself with the right people. Don't let mom manage you. Let mom get you started and then hook you up with somebody if you're like a singer, or if you're, so it just goes down the line. If you're going to be in any business, if you're a pitchman, you've got to go to those really annoying conferences and walk around to the different booths and meet people who have been doing it longer, and see what they're doing, and see the little idioms and idiosyncrasies and little techniques that they have. And sales is also really an important thing. You've got to be a salesman or saleswoman, whether you hate it or not. It's because that's what you're doing. You're selling yourself. You're selling yourself as a product. And a lot of people think that there's kind of this like negativity, like Eddie Vedder Pearl Jam thing, where like at the beginning of Pearl Jam, he hated doing interviews. Then he was in USA Today in the 2000s when they had kind of stopped having hits. He's like, gosh, we really appreciate the press, guys. And it just shows you how that always comes full circle. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And no, one last question.
Yes,
Who do
ma'am.
you think was the most interesting musician that you've crossed paths with over these years?
That I've worked with?
Or cross paths with, either or.
Some of that's legally, because I've got books I started and we didn't. Yeah,
Okay, well,
I would
let's
say
take them out that we know about already. The ones that we are allowed to talk about.
2 of them, Ann and Nancy Wilson from Heart, because they're so iconic.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you a quick story. I went and took a gamble. I interviewed everybody first, and then I approached them, and their manager was like, oh, okay, well, I guess we'll get you interviews with the girls. And I was like, huh? It just because it was a risk, because I wanted to have all of my ammo. But definitely them, definitely Lemmy Kilmister, rest in peace, from Motorhead. And absolutely one of the most remarkable people, that I've ever written with, Joe Satriani. He's the world's best-selling instrumental guitar player. We spent 3 years writing that book, and it put me on it just took me some places I didn't expect to go commercially. And also Freddie Powers and Merle Haggard. I wrote a book with them before they both passed that actually we're turning into a film now called The Spree of '83. And it's basically just a remarkable, Merle Haggard's just Merle Haggard. Willie Nelson's in that book. I mean, so that was absolutely a project. These projects take on, and right now, the last thing, because I do so many, there's a summer camp called 40 Legends. It's been open. It was open 25 years. I went there for 6. I'm writing it. I think it's like the first authorized book of a summer camp ever, or one of them. And we're working on that. So those would be some. I can't give you one, but those would be some. And
It's
Teddy
totally
Riley.
okay.
Teddy Riley as well.
You sure you don't have one more?
That's it.
We'll stop there. Jake, thank you so much for joining us. If you would like to look at any of his resumes of books or any articles he's ever written, you can head to jakebrownbooks.com. You can purchase all of the books, all 50 of them if you really want to, all at Amazon. Yes, right there for you. Jake, once again, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm your host, Lenora, and that's a wrap on another episode of the Brand Ambassador Select Podcast. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss one, and we'll see you next time.
One of my favorite interviews. Thank you again.